Desligar o celular? Pessoal, cuidado com os celulares para não dar interferência na transmissão, tá? Então, a hora que os meninos... Pessoal, então, bom dia. Eu sou o professor Luciano aqui, o professor Luciano Maluli aqui da USP, né? E hoje a gente tem assim o prazer, né, de receber o jornalista Andrew Revkin. O professor Denis vai falar um pouco do Andrew daqui a pouco para vocês. Ele vai dar uma palestra super importante para a gente hoje, né, sobre essas mudanças climáticas e desinformação. O professor Denis vai falar um pouco sobre a trajetória, talvez um dos principais jornalistas do mundo hoje. Então, vocês têm o prazer aqui, a turma, de conviver com esses momentos. Para isso, gente, hoje quem vai mediar é o professor Denis de Oliveira, professor de vocês, né, aqui no Departamento de Jornalismo e Editoração. E a gente convidou a Carolina Dantas, que está chegando, né, que é editora da Info Amazônica, e também a Andréia Terçarial Couto, que é pesquisadora, professora, colaborou aqui com o departamento e realizou uma pesquisa de pós-doutorado recentemente sobre jornalismo ambiental, talvez uma das áreas mais complexas e importantes para quem trabalha com jornalismo hoje. A gente agradece profundamente a Juliana e o pessoal do Consulado dos Estados Unidos, que esse é um evento da comemoração dos 200 anos da imigração americana no Brasil, norte-americana no Brasil. Para vocês terem uma ideia, só para puxar a meu lado, né, vocês sabem que eu sou de Piraju, no interior, e Piraju tem uma usina. Piraju tem uma usina hidrelétrica, uma das mais antigas do país, né, junto com o Rio de Janeiro. Tá? A energia elétrica começou no Rio de Janeiro e 3 dias depois lá, e a usina foi construída por norte-americanos. Então, a cidade está cheia de fotos do presidente Roosevelt. Quando ele veio para o Brasil, ele passou por lá. Tem a história da cidade baseada na construção da usina, porque o filho dele era o engenheiro dessa usina. Então, um evento comemorativo, e a gente fez de tudo aqui do Departamento de Jornalismo para trazer esse evento para cá com o convite do consulado norte-americano. Tá? Então, para a gente não perder tempo, o professor Denis vai explicar a dinâmica vai ser rápida, o André vai falar entre 30, mais ou menos uma meia hora com vocês, e depois a gente convidou os jornalistas e vocês para fazerem as perguntas. Tá? A turma já está preparada. Então, professor Denis, para apresentar o André, muito obrigado.
Muito bem, bom dia a todas e todos e todes. Então a gente vai dar início então ao nosso evento, né? Só apresentando o nosso convidado, nosso conferencista, o Andrew Revkin. Além de um jornalista ambiental respeitado, né, um dos mais respeitados e admirados dos Estados Unidos, né, ele também é diretor da Iniciativa em Comunicação e Sustentabilidade da Universidade de Colômbia, né, do Earth Institute, Universidade de Colômbia. Lembrando, a Universidade de Colômbia é uma universidade, né, que tem uns cursos de referência de jornalismo no mundo, né? Lá na Universidade de Colômbia, ele desenvolve programas, cursos, ferramentas e colaborações para facilitar e promover a comunicação entre cientistas e a sociedade, com o objetivo de reduzir riscos climáticos e fortalecer a resiliência social e ambiental. Então, Revkin possui mais de 30 anos de experiência escrevendo sobre mudanças climáticas, com reportagens que vão do Polo Norte à Casa Branca, da floresta amazônica ao Vaticano, principalmente para o New York Times, e também trabalhou para a National Geographic e Discovery Magazine. Ganhou diversos prêmios de jornalismo científico e uma bolsa Guggenheim. Revkin é autor de livros aclamados sobre a história da interação humana com o clima, transformações no Ártico, aquecimento global e desafios enfrentados pela floresta amazônica, além de ter escrito 3 capítulos de livros sobre comunicação científica. Seu trabalho inspirou produção de filmes como Rockstar, da Warner Brothers, The Burning Season, da HBO, vencedor de 3 Globos de Ouro, baseado na biografia de Revkin sobre Chico Mendes, além de sua carreira jornalística e literária. Ele também é músico e compositor. Não vai tocar aqui pra gente, né? Mas só pra gente saber que também é músico e compositor. Então, Revkin, por favor, tenha bondade de vir aqui pra mesa. Vamos receber com palmas aqui o nosso convidado. Eu vou chamar aqui para a mesa também a nossa companheira Andréa Couto, que vai fazer, né, vai ser a debatedora nossa, né, para a gente animar aqui a discussão. Andréa, por favor, né, o Luciano já apresentou. Então, a nossa dinâmica vai ser o seguinte, né? Então, o Andrew vai ter 30, 35 minutos para fazer sua exposição inicial. Depois eu passo para a professora Andréa fazer as perguntas como debatedora. E após, a gente passa, então, para os que estão aqui presentes, né, para os convidados, para a plateia fazer as questões aqui para o Andrew, ok? Quem tiver com o tradutor, né, canal 2 para a língua portuguesa. Por favor, Andrew, tenha bondade.
Obrigado, muito obrigado. It's a great honor to be here. Infelizmente, eu não falo português, so I will be speaking in English. And eu devo praticar mais. Talvez the lights be turned off, or for people to see a little better. If not, it's not a problem. It's good. I could just go closer. I am a musician, so I know. In English, you say eat the mic," and then suddenly it becomes clearer. So I'm going to take you on a quick journey through my own experience since I was about 30 years old, which is when I started on this climate journey as a journalist. Próxima slide. So yeah, I've been very fortunate. One of the great things about being a journalist is you get to experience many dimensions of the world, things that people care about. You also get to ask questions of important people, and just be in nature if you're lucky as an environmental journalist. So I've been to the North Pole, the Vatican, for a big meeting on sustainable humanity in 2014. That was me on the Juruá River in the western corner of Acre in 1989, when I was researching my book, The Burning Season, taking notes in my pad. And that's a giant fish in the Hudson River. You have unbelievable fish in the Amazon. I was in Belém yesterday, and the fish market there is full of incredible diversity of species of fish that are an important part of the economy. And one of the key realities for Brazil for COP30 coming to Belém next year is to demonstrate that the Amazon is not just about species, it's about a relationship between humanity and the rest of the living world. And hopefully people will see that when they come to COP30, if there are enough hotel rooms. So next slide. So here I am at the beginning of my career. I started as a journalist 41 years ago, but I was on the staff of this science magazine. In 1988, the efeito estufa, global warming, the greenhouse effect, became a significant news story. And I was asked to write my first cover story on this issue. And it's that's the way journalism is. We create a caricature to sell people, to get people to focus on something. We make a very dramatic demonstration of the problem. Next slide. Just click one more. And look what was on the back cover of our magazine. It's a cigarette ad. So we're selling global warming and cigarettes. And that was, at that time in the newsroom at the magazine, we weren't thinking about that kind of complicated picture. But I think it's very important to think about that, And climate change, as I reported on it more and more from that point going forward, became a more complicated picture. It was not like that simple cover of a burning world. It was about energy. It's about development. It's about how humans perceive or misperceive problems in the world. Next slide. So recently, now I'm more of a blogger and an online communicator, so I create memes. And this is, to me, climate change is I call it a complexity monster. the complexity monster stalks around all the efforts to solve the climate problem. It has many heads. It's got our need for energy, the political polarization. So there's the reporter and the editor, and there's the problem. And this seems to make it almost impossible as a story. And I've listed here how it started out in my brain as a pollution problem. We're burning fuels that emits gases. They have effects on the environment, and that changes our landscape of risk. And then it was like a technical story. Well, okay, so we need nuclear power, or we need new solar panels, we need lots of science. But that was completely insufficient because obviously we haven't done that successfully. And I'm thinking, okay, so many of my journalism friends see it as a heroes and villains story, good guy, bad guy, Greenpeace, Exxon, or oil companies and coal companies. But that's a complicated story too, because we need energy. And developing countries in Africa, here in Latin America, have lots of fossil fuels. The United States and Europe burned coal and oil for 100 years. So it's not a good guy, bad guy story. Fossil fuels have great benefits too. It's a justice story, absolutely a justice story, because if you look in Nigeria, where oil comes out of the ground, so few people in Nigeria benefit from that oil, and they're exposed to the pollution. And then, of course, climate impacts mainly impact people who are poor or on the margins of society because of racism or other issues. So it's a justice story. It's a behavior story. You'll learn more about that in a minute, because we don't perceive some kinds of risks very well. So it's too big to be a story. There's a philosopher named Timothy Morton who has been using this word hyperobject. Just Google for it and you'll see what it's about. It's things that have dimensions that are much bigger than we think. That's, again, I saw it as a pollution problem. It's every problem. So ultimately, it's every story. And that can feel paralytic to a journalist or to a politician or anyone who wants to solve the problem. It's not like pollution, where you just put a filter on a smokestack and you solve the problem. But what I'm going to talk about here for a few minutes is how this is actually a great opportunity. The way to manage this monster, and you don't solve this monster. None of you are going to write an article or do a TV show that says, this is it, we fixed it. It's not like that. It's like a new dimension of the human experience is actually an old dimension of the human experience is our relationship with the climate and with energy. And we're on a journey toward better management of it. We manage this beast, and writing about the different dimensions of it gives you a whole palette of stories to pursue. So it's not just like the us and them story. A key to that is the thing that you all know about already, which is the tool of journalism that's the most important one, is the question mark. Asking productive questions that lead you to clarity and to progress. Next slide. By the way, my 1988 article, which looked kind of simple, right? Global warming. Actually, I'm really happy now, 34 years later, to see that I included elements in my article that reflected the complexity. This line on China, for example, in 1988, a lot of environmentalists, and even now, a lot of environmentalists say, we have to stop burning fossil fuels, no more coal. But back then, I wrote, how can the developed countries, meaning the United States and Europe, Japan, how can we expect China to just not burn its fuel, the coal they have? And that's turned out to be a really important reality. That graph over there, you don't need to know the numbers, shows China's economy from 1975 to now. And that is basically burning a lot of fuel. That was burning a lot of coal, but it brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Should China not have burned the coal? I'd say that's complicated, right? Those are new power plants that are being proposed in China, coal-fired power plants. China's selling a lot of electric vehicles. They're also burning a lot of coal. And who are we to say no to China? Next slide. So in 1989, I came to this wonderful country. And I learned even more profoundly how issues we think of as environmental problems are at their root are social problems and political problems. I wrote the book about Chico Mendes. I spent 4 months in Amazonia, mostly in Acre and in Manaus. I had a good friend of mine who is Fernando Alegrete, who was a botany graduate student who spoke beautiful Portuguese. He's Brazilian, which is why I never adequately learned how to speak Portuguese. I had a colleague, and we went out into the forest with rubber tappers, with seringueiros, and I took this picture during what's called an empate. Empatar was to the seringueiros would form, try to block the cutting crews. And what I learned was these guys used to be seringueiros. They moved into the town to Rio Branco for work, and because they're poor and they needed to work, and so they're cutting trees. But it's not like good guy, bad guy, right? It's very different. The people in power who are using violence to push people off the land have to be suppressed, and there's plenty to do there still related to land rights and the like. But it's a social, political dynamic, not just about burning. Next slide. And in 1989, Amazonia was this remarkable place of rapid change. You know, you've got TV, telenovelas and sloths in the restaurants. And I'll never forget when I saw this funeral parlor in Manaus with, I look at it now and I think about, it's like a Starbucks, right? You have small, medium, large, but this is coffins. And it was normal. I met many Robert Seringueiro families who had lost many children to simple preventable disease. So development, access to basics is a really important part of building a country or a region that can survive its in the environment. Next slide. And then I came to this ecosystem. So I spent time in the rainforest. And for those who know about newspapers or TV, it's an ecosystem, and everything is competing. All these different stories they're like vines and trees competing for the sunlight, competing for the front page. And we all want to be on the front page as journalists. And many of my stories that made the front page related to climate were about the politics of the problem. By the way, that was kind of a distortion because there are many other dimensions of the climate problem that need attention, but we focus on politics because there's people fighting, and it has all those elements that we journalists like. Next slide. So the newsroom environment, the newsroom climate, has all of these dynamics that are problematic for stories about complex situations. I wrote many years ago, I wrote on my blog at the New York Times about the front page thought. A story has to have that drama, importance. It has to be about now. It has to be about right now to be the front page. You're competing with, the World Cup and with corruption by some business and all these other stories are trying to be in the front page. And just take a picture of that and you can learn more later. I don't want to waste too much time. Next slide. Maybe they can share this deck actually. So I'm trying, as a news reporter, I was facing that ecosystem as a journalist. This is like, and I started to think, well, this is a complex problem. It's not going to get a front page story all the time. How can I be useful to my readers? And I started a blog at the New York Times called .Earth. But it really came to me in 2003 at the North Pole. I went there for the Times, flew down onto the sea ice at the North Pole with scientists to write about their project studying climate change in the Arctic Ocean. And I took video, and I was very proud of all the multimedia stuff I did. We call them backpack journalists, where you're doing the writing, the reporting, the photography. And that was all exciting. But the thing that really excited me was the next slide. While I was there, 2003, so this is a long time ago, a young editor back on the website of the New York Times at nytimes.com, I was on the satellite phone with her, and she said, hey, let's do a reader forum. We'll put a note on the homepage. Andrew Revkin is a reporter. He's at the North Pole. What questions do you have? And this is before like Reddit, AMAs, Ask Me Anything. And we did this. And I was really kind of excited because I was explaining the process of journalism. I was having a simultaneous relationship with my audience, not just taking notes, writing a story, and then going to sleep. And that led me to the idea of blogging and the like. So finding that opportunity in your journalism to get beyond the dimensions that you think are the job, finding a way, always keep in your mind, what do my readers need, or listeners or viewers? What are the tools I have at hand? Some of them are still traditional. Investigative journalism is important. Narrative journalism is important, but this is really important too, connecting in a two-direction path with your audience. Next slide. Oh, I think maybe I cut too many. The social climate. So that was the newsroom climate. The social climate is the reality that our relationship with the environment is mediated by something called the brain. And our brains evolved for quick, dramatic problems, like you're being chased by a predator. And these slow problems are really hard for us to negotiate and navigate. And I started interviewing social scientists, not just climate scientists, about problems. And that really added a whole additional variety of articles to convey. About why, if you think, why are we polarized? There's scientists who understand that through research. Next slide. So I started this blog. This is 2007. And I started on Twitter around the same time. I'm a big fan of Twitter, X. Just go on at Revkin if you want to find me on Twitter. Even with all of the things that Elon Musk has done, it's not like other places online. It's still better. But it's like a polluted river. The usefulness goes by diving under the surface. When you go on X, search for things, search for scientists, search for expertise, and you can have a great time there and productive. But the blogging was like this too. It was a relationship with my readers. My articles, many of them were about questions. They weren't me telling you, I just discovered this thing, this is what you should think. They were more about engagement. I did 2,810 posts in 9 years of blogging, and there were 100,000 comments. And some of them were garbage, but many of them led me to new ways to think about how to do my journalism. It was a fantastic experience. And you can still search the blog. It's just search for .earth and Revkin. Next slide. Now here, I think this is valuable. This was my most viewed post on .earth. It was many hundreds of thousands of views. And it was about a sinkhole that formed in Guatemala City. And you can see why it was, this is before the idea of viral. This is like 2010. And I was one of the first journalists to see this photograph of what had happened. It was a dramatic incident where heavy rains had happened and this giant hole, it looks like a hole to the center of the earth, formed. And I was very happy, right? We all want clicks. We all want that dynamic of being first and getting a lot of attention. But what I missed was, I didn't think, maybe I should think, why is there a sinkhole in Guatemala City? What's the geology? What makes this city have this risk? And next slide. If I had thought just another few minutes, I would have found the research about the volcano near Guatemala City that has generated for thousands of years layers of ash. Ash is this like loose volcanic material. And the city is essentially built on ash. And that's why you get sinkholes. And that would have been much more valuable for my readers, so that I would still have the eyeballs, but also give them information and insights. So I think if we can all find that moment when you're doing a report on something, to just pause and say, well, what's the actual value I can add to this? So it's not just about, wow. I think that's really a valuable thing to think about. Next. You know, and I was so excited about blogging and the internet, and I became a champion for the idea of social media. And then this happened. It became noisy and polarizing, and it's like we went from the old model of the nightly news anchor or the newspaper being the authority to everyone being able to find information that suits your own ideas, your own culture, your own politics. And that was like, oh, now what do we do? And that's where the misinformation issue comes in. Anything that we think of as misinformation, someone else embraces as information now, as actual information. We have presidential candidate, and we have the situation where false information is completely ubiquitous, and it gets to be very hard to navigate. And how do you build in your journalism the idea this is the place to come if you want to cut through? Next. Oh, you can go. Next slide. Yeah. So, and this, just briefly, this is some of the science on climate change. Dan Kahane did a lot of research 10, 15 years ago showing that basic understanding of climate science is highest at both ends of the spectrum of belief on climate change. People who deny that it's a problem, people who are really worried, are both have the most literacy in what's a greenhouse gas, what is climate, et cetera. That's really depressing as a journalist, because, especially as a science journalist, because you think information changes people. Well, no, it actually can reinforce them to be who they are already. That can feel, as I said earlier, that can feel dispiriting and depressing, but that also leads to opportunities. Next slide. Actually, let's skip this one. Next slide. There's another body of social science which shows social and biological science that shows that in a community or in an ecosystem, your resilience, your ability to adapt and endure when you're facing a complex challenge like climate change is a function of diversity. You want to have diversity of opinion, diversity of perspective, diversity of expertise. If we were all Greta Thunberg, the young Swedish activist, sitting in the streets, or if we were all Bill Gates, who I got to interview once, sitting in his, building his nuclear power plants, we'd be screwed. We need both. You need the dynamics in society that can accept the diversity of approaches. And there are many, I know many climate activists who hate Bill Gates because they think he's doing the wrong thing. And I'm like, well, get comfortable with that, because if you're all sitting in the streets, we get nothing done. The whole idea of sitting in the streets is to activate other people to do things. So, I think that's a story, and it's a way to avoid in your journalism getting captured by one narrative. And too often, I see that happening these days in climate journalism, particularly. It's the good guy, bad guy thing. Next slide. And so my big climate change, my own personal climate change, has been away from the idea this is a single, simple story about cutting pollution, and from the idea that a story, an article, is our product in journalism. You know, we all say, great story. And that's true for some things. You know, you write a great story, that's great. But the other kinds of relationship with your audience, I think, is more important. Developing and spreading the capacity for people to communicate across differences to solve problems that require an anthropologist and an engineer. That's the path forward. And the other big thing is to move away from centering our reporting on climate change, which is the greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, to climate risk. Risk is what communities care about and what politicians care about. Are we at risk? So next slide. And just do take a picture of this if you can, because this is really the core opportunity. When you have that complexity monster, right? The complexity monster has no starting point. But when you break it in pieces, suddenly you have stories all around you. Risk, climate risk requires a hazard, like the fires around Sao Paulo State, or storms, cyclones, hurricanes, rising seas. So the hazard, but the hazard has no meaning unless there's exposure. We live there, you know, where you live is in an area of hazard. And vulnerability, most important of all, vulnerability. And next slide. Like, these are two places that are 80 miles from the equator. In 2016, I was in Nairobi and Singapore for different reasons. And Singapore is rich and technologically high level, and they have these amazing gardens there. They're all in glass domes. It's like being in Futurama. And tourists come, and it's at the equator. It's like Belém, but it's like being in a cool building in Sao Paulo. And this slum in Nairobi, this informal settlement, is the same climate, completely exposed and vulnerable to the elements. Dirty water, very little electricity, and they're in a city. Other parts of Nairobi are doing fine, but it's poor people who are vulnerable, or tribes who moved in who don't have, getting a little static, tribes who moved in and are living in the margins. They're living in areas that are dangerous. Next slide. Actually, I'll take that out until the question. So this is just one more example, one more idea. Risk is hazard times exposure, factoring in vulnerability. And when you're a reporter, when an event happens, like the fires in Sao Paulo, so you say, okay, what is the nature of the hazard? Is the hazard changing? What creates big fire? And exposure and vulnerability. You know, how is it harming society? Well, pollution. Is it better to have a lot of small fires than one big fire? That's in the United States. This is a big challenge. We want to burn the California forests in a managed way, so you don't end up with these gigantic fires that generate pollution over San Francisco and the like. And it's just, that's the path to sanity and productivity as a journalist. Start asking those questions. Who is at risk? Why? And you start to get this landscape of opportunity instead of just kind of confusion and people with messages. Next slide. And the good news about vulnerability is we can fix that problem because it's local. Heat waves are getting hotter because of global warming, and that's going to keep happening. But an important scientist on that who lives in Seattle, Washington, they had one of those, they're called a heat dome, like an extreme heat wave. And she's in it, and I interviewed her on my podcast, and she said, nobody needs to die in a heat wave. And here's why. And she listed the things you can do in a town, in a city, mostly related to thinking about people who have to work outdoors, poor elderly people, who's taking care of them, and who has air conditioning, et cetera. So, and then for flooding and other kinds of climate disasters, the world has done a wonderful job. The news, you'd never know it reading most newspapers because we focus on individual events, you know, the heat wave, the flood, but we don't look at the data. And the data show that this is basically, there's fewer and fewer people are being killed by severe weather, severe storms over time, especially since the 1970s, which is the middle of the graph there. And that happened in like no time. In Bangladesh, in 1970, they had a cyclone that killed 500,000 people, one storm. They've had similar storms recently, and every death is a tragedy, but the number of people who die now is like 50. So it's gone from 500,000 to dozens of deaths. Because they've changed designs, they have very simple architecture for people to go. They have radio and social media and weather forecasts, and technology has made a big difference. So that's something you can really work on. Next slide. And so what about the carbon dioxide, right? This is climate change. We still need to think about that problem. This is from 1700 until now. That's the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. How many parts per million? And it's up, 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 up. And that's that's not good because it's generating, seas are going to rise for centuries to come. Next slide. And this is a graph that's essentially from the year 1800 until 2020. This shows you how much carbon is in each unit of energy we produce. Global, the whole global. If you add up all the energy humanity's uses globally, and you estimate how much carbon comes from burning that energy. It's we're already on a decarbonization pathway. We're doing things better, but it's a very long journey. And anything Al Gore does or Greta does is not going to really change that reality. And that's what leads me to focusing on vulnerability. If you get the vulnerability reduction, you can give us more time to grapple with the energy revolution, which is happening, but it's slow. But you'll never hear that at COP30, because at COP30 you'll see the Secretary General or someone else stand up and going, we need to be urgent and active and stop all fossil fuels, and it's just not like that. And I find it really important that's when the basic journalistic principles get into your head. What's going on? What's driving risk? What can change? What is someone telling me that's not realistic? And that can be inconvenient because it means your journalism won't follow a conventional narrative, but it's something that I think is really important. Next slide. I'll be finishing in a second. And this landscape is not partisan. You can, there was a flood in Louisiana that I wrote about maybe 8 years ago. And that's a house that was built in the 1970s that got terribly flooded. It was like a meter of rain in a day. The house there was built in the 1800s, and it's elevated off the ground. So they knew something in 1800s that was forgotten in 1970. And so think about stories related to real estate or community zoning, regional zoning. Are we building vulnerability? Anywhere where you see someone building vulnerability, that's a story, right? And because they're just setting us up for a disaster. And it's about business and commerce and profit and all that stuff. And energy transitions. This is a woman I interviewed in India in 2017. She's cooking on a fire, high levels of pollution. And actually, it would be good for her to have fossil fuel. So anyone out there who says no fossil fuels should meet this woman in the center of India. Next slide. Bottom line, this is what I live by. My blog, I call it Sustain What? It's a question. And it's because the word sustainability, if I asked you all to scribble on a piece of paper right now, what does that mean? What does it mean? Sustainability. You'd have 5 or 6 different answers. So ask sustain what? Like what level of climate change? Or how many species? For whom? How? And then you're starting to practice journalism. And it's not climate journalism, it's just journalism. So even though I've focused on climate change for 40 years, I think it's just the basic principles of asking productive questions, getting past narratives that someone is trying to hand to you that will lead you to have a big basket of articles and relationships with readers that can make a big difference. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much. And I'm easy to find, right? So ask me questions, find me online. Revkin@gmail.
Oi?
Bom dia a todos. É um prazer estar aqui com vocês. Sou Carolina Dantas, editora da Infomazônia, e eu vou mediar essa mesa com vocês. Então, assim, no decorrer dessa conversa, se sintam à vontade para procurar e deixar bilhetinhos com perguntas, ou mesmo levantar a mão se quiserem fazer alguma pergunta. E a gente vai fazer um bate-papo mesmo e conversar sobre a cobertura climática, que ele falou que nem é mais cobertura climática, é só jornalismo, né, hoje em dia. Mas e tentar entender desse incrível profissional que está aqui do nosso lado, o que a gente pode aprender com ele e trocar aqui num bate-papo legal. Eu queria começar com uma pergunta, que eu acho que é uma pergunta até relativamente mais a minha curiosidade, uma pergunta até básica, que é no sentido assim, ao mesmo tempo que o clima muda muito rápido, a gente vê o jornalismo também tendo novas tecnologias o tempo inteiro, da inteligência artificial aos dados geolocalizados. Quais são, assim, na sua opinião, talvez os top 3 ou top 5 habilidades que um jornalista climático tem que desenvolver tecnicamente nos dias de hoje para fazer uma cobertura bem feita?
Well, my answer starts with Info Amazonia. It's an amazing innovation. Gustavo Faleros and others started out, was it 10 years ago? I don't know. 12? Yeah. With building the idea of geojournalism, like journalism across, with mapping and data, and multiple journalists working on the same question across a region like Amazonia. And that led to Info Nile, Info Congo. There's one in the Himalayas, the third pole. Just having that idea of having journalism that's not just a reporter with a microphone going to the Amazon, and building a kind of a multidimensional approach to the problem, and storytelling is fantastic. So that's the first thing I'll say. You know, seriously. And I guess it gets back to what I was saying about when I was at the North Pole. You know, it's a mindset to think about, here I am, I got cameras, there was no photographer, I should take video. If you're using whatever tools you have, but then that conversation with my editor, Rebecca de Moline, who was like a low-level assistant editor, who said, let's do an AMA. This is before Ask Me Anything. So thinking actively about what's a new way to do something is really the mindset. And technology matters hugely. Amazon, I was just up in Belém at the offices of Amazon, IMAZON, and they are a data repository. They're using data analytically to understand where deforestation is happening, and actually to predict. They have a predictive capacity for deforestation that's fantastic. And there are frontiers there that are really important, related to beef production and industries that are behaving badly and those that are behaving well. So finding new partners who have the data is really part of it too.
Eu queria também que os professores se apresentassem. Cometi uma gafe terrível aqui antes de começar.
Não, a gente apresentou.
Já se apresentou.
Tá.
E ver se vocês têm alguma pergunta também para o Andrew. Começar pela professora Andréia.
Bom dia. Primeiramente, eu gostaria de parabenizar o departamento CJE e também ao Consulado Norte-Americano por promover esse evento extremamente importante. E também agradecer o convite de estar aqui participando, e na mesma mesa que esse profissional maravilhoso, que é o professor e jornalista Mr. Harvey. Eu conheço o seu trabalho de longa data e aprecio muito o seu trabalho. E eu gostaria de fazer algumas perguntas, inclusive várias, mas eu sei que o nosso tempo é muito curto. Eu vou começar por uma questão que eu li um artigo seu, My Climate Change, de 16, um artigo que eu gosto muito, onde o senhor diz que, em meados da década de 90, quando chegou no The New York Times, não havia uma predisposição muito grande para receber matérias sobre mudanças climáticas, para emplacar isso mesmo na primeira página, porque os jornais estavam muito mais preocupados com outras questões, né? Que seriam mais como terremotos, mudanças na Bolsa de Valores, etc. Uma pergunta inicial seria, passados tantos anos, isso mudou? Né? Me parece que não, particularmente, gostaria de saber a sua opinião. Como reportar hoje, né, sobre as mudanças climáticas, que me parece um ambiente ainda pouco aberto para falar abertamente sobre isso. Essa é uma questão. Eu vou deixar as outras para depois.
That's a great question, and it's great to meet you here as well. I know you're doing a lot of hard work, and I think one possibility, and this exists in newsrooms, is to consider when you're writing an article about real estate, for example, have a conversation with the science writer or the climate-focused desk, so that you're not just thinking about the real estate. In the United States, I'm not sure if you have in Brazil, well, I know you have online sales of homes, right? Like we have Zillow and Redfin, and you have websites that do that. Some have started some listings for real estate now include the flood history of the property, like that house in New Orleans, in Louisiana. Now, if you're going to buy a house, you now can know, well, was this house flooded before? That would be very important information to know, right? But only in half of the United States is that normal yet. So 25 states, you go to a real estate listing for a house, and you don't know it's the history of flooding. Same thing for fire. So journalists need to think about the climate dimension of any story. The problem is in our news rooms or in our media, people are in their little silos. You're a real estate reporter, you're a climate reporter. So finding that dialogue is important. And I've used Twitter a lot to press. When I see the New York Times, after I was at the New York Times, they had an article about a fancy new building in Miami on the beach, and it didn't mention rising seas. It didn't mention anything about climate aspects of that project. And I think that's a real failure, especially for a big institution like the New York Times. So I think that's the big opportunity, one of the big opportunities. So it's not like we need to do more climate reporting. We need to make sure we consider those aspects of the other stories. And the same thing for energy. Energy is really important, and making sure we're thinking about that across the dimensions of news is one solution.
Posso continuar?
Pode.
Bom, o senhor chegou aqui num momento terrível, né? O senhor sabe que a semana passada nós tivemos uma onda de incêndios. Existem alguns inquéritos em aberto para verificar se foram criminosos ou não. O fato é que, em 2019, nós tivemos também um terrível chamado Dia do Fogo, lá no norte do país, em que alguns fazendeiros do agronegócio incendiaram praticamente 2 cidades, ao redor de 2 cidades. E nós, a semana passada, vivenciamos essa coisa terrível, né, que foi isso. Nós temos também um problema aqui, que, apesar de todas as evidências de degradação ambiental levadas a cabo por esse agronegócio, vamos chamar assim, que enfim, está aí, né? Há uma dificuldade muito grande por parte da população em verificar esse tipo de coisa, em ver, em aceitar. porque sempre há um discurso por parte de uma parte da população de que o agronegócio é o grande carro-chefe que produz comida, né? Enquanto que nós sabemos que não é verdade, ele não produz comida, ele produz commodities para exportação, e quem produz comida no país é o pequeno agricultor, né? A agricultura familiar. Então, aqui um problema muito grave, porque nós somos cobrados, né? Como nós temos 7 biomas particularmente muito importantes, e que alguns são patrimônio natural da humanidade, o Brasil é muito cobrado para a proteção desses biomas. No entanto, nós temos um Congresso pouco afeito à proteção ambiental, não é? Eles atacam cotidianamente o nosso Código Florestal, que, a princípio, foi um Código Florestal oriundo da Constituição de 88, um excelente código ambiental que está sendo atacado todos os dias. Algumas alterações já foram realizadas, e também alguns projetos de lei que passam, têm sido... cotidianamente também chegam no Congresso propostas de lei que querem mudar situações em áreas de preservação ambiental. Então, assim, como o senhor vê isso, né? Ao mesmo tempo que o mundo está de olho no Cerrado, no Pantanal, na Amazônia, cobrando, e eu acho que tem que cobrar mesmo, né? Essa proteção. Vocês têm, será, essa noção, o mundo lá fora tem essa noção de que existe um Congresso aqui que emperra toda e qualquer ação socioambiental, mesmo com um governo federal que é muito amigável a essa situação, né? Ele defende o meio ambiente, mas o Congresso, infelizmente, barra esse tipo de coisa, né?
Yeah. Well, no, this obviously the political dimensions of this are critically important, and everything you're describing is paralleled in the United States Congress. We have our own eagerness to dismantle regulations right now, and will play out in the coming months with this next election, not just the president. What I think a conversation I also had at Amazon in Belém is relevant. What they have shown with data and others over the last 10 years is that you can have a business model for beef production. You can continue producing beef in ways that stop deforestation. They're more intensive, where you're supporting the cattle in different ways, so you don't need to do new deforestation. And you can actually restore forests. And that's telling that story more can maybe start to tip the balance toward the agro-industry not being a unitary thing. Remember the good guy, bad guy? The media love good guy, bad guy. We like to oversimplify. Every fazendero is the enemy. And we do that all the time in different contexts. But if we amplify the story of productivity can happen even for beef. You can still have your beef and your forest. Putting the lens on those examples can maybe change things. But you mentioned international pressure. This is where China has an incredibly important opportunity, and that it has not yet expressed for beef. Many beef exports are going to China, not just to the United States and Europe. And as long as they are not demanding that the beef comes from areas that are productively limiting deforestation, this is not going to change. So figuring out ways, not just for the West, but for China and Asia to develop markets and incentives and rules for their imports, that's really important. Here, there is this other dimension, though, just briefly. When I was in the Amazon in 1989, and when I was there 2 days ago, I still hear, oh, well, you North Americanos, you want to steal our Amazon. You say, this is Nossa Amazonia, not your Tua Amazonia. So international pressure has to be careful, calibrated more around markets and less around like COP30, where, you know, if John Kerry, our former climate guy, I criticized him in some of my writing because he was too finger-wagging about some things. And I think using the more productive way of looking for solutions is better than, we need to save the Amazon for the whole world. That doesn't feel like a good message for Brazil to grab onto.
Thank you.
Deixa para os alunos para perguntarem, né?
Eu ia falar justamente para o professor Denis fazer uma pergunta.
Não, eu faço no final. Acho legal passar para os alunos agora. Até depois do final.
Eu só queria fazer uma segunda. Não vai dar, então. Vamos ver se o pessoal quer fazer uma pergunta, então. Se quiser, vamos ver se vai ter coragem para vir aqui na frente ou se o pessoal vai querer mandar um papelzinho.
Oi, tudo bem? Meu nome é Isabela. Eu queria saber, aqui no Brasil a gente tem muitos casos de desastres climáticos em que empresas muito grandes são responsabilizadas por isso. Então, por exemplo, a gente teve o caso de Brumadinho e Mariana, em que uma empresa muito grande aqui no Brasil, a Vale, foi responsável pelo derramamento de lama que inundou essas cidades inteiras. Foi uma coisa horrível. E aí eu queria saber como que a gente faz essa cobertura de casos em que grandes empresas são responsáveis pelo desastre, enfim, sem se preservando como jornalista, porque fica perigoso para a gente, né, lidar com essas grandes empresas e corporações.
No, this is really important, and this is everywhere. I think that's. I worked briefly at ProPublica, which is an investigative journalism project in the United States, supported as a nonprofit. People donate. And they've done incredibly consequential journalism around corporate and governmental misbehavior. And that's the hardest thing to sustain right now because newsrooms are shrinking. There are ways to do it, like ProPublica. There's sources of money for investigative reporting internationally as well. And it's just, that's a really big component of this. And what's really valuable about you describing that story that way is the media who say there was a big flood and it's climate change are obscuring that reality, that there's irresponsibility, there's culpability on the ground. It's not just climate change. It's about water management. Same thing in Pakistan a couple of years ago. Terrible flooding. The government there quickly was like, oh, it's climate change. It's because of greenhouse gases and fossil fuels. No, it's partially, but it's mostly about irresponsible development on the ground. So it's hard. It's a hard story. It can, I never was truly in danger. I had people, I didn't play the clip. Rush Limbaugh, famous conservative radio guy, said one day, Andy Revkin of the New York Times, if you think people are the worst thing that ever happened to the planet, why don't you kill yourself? He did to like millions of people. So, that happens. But the other people who are at risk are much more at risk than we as journalists. So just doing it's the hardest work of all, is that the accountability journalism, but it's so important.
Tudo bem? Bom dia. Meu nome é Catarina. E eu queria perguntar que, não só aqui no Brasil, mas principalmente aqui no Brasil, e envolvendo casos como o do Chico Mendes, então, figuras na Amazônia que tem essa questão de disputa de terra, de comunidades indígenas, de ativistas ambientais e de fazendeiras do agronegócio e toda essa questão. Se em algum momento que você estivesse fazendo alguma reportagem, não necessariamente na Amazônia, mas estivesse investigando, você sentiu que você estava ameaçado de alguma forma. Seja, não necessariamente uma coisa física, mas alguma espécie de pressão psicológica, alguma coisa relacionada ao seu emprego, ameaçada de algum jeito.
Yeah, sure. But you know, we all make choices, right? I understand both here in the United States, many young journalists want to just be influencers or write about sports and stuff. And so your first decision in choosing to write about a serious issue, corruption in industry or in politics, or ranchers killing seringueiros, is a big decision. And I think we need to have some journalists who are willing to just take that first step. And then it's really just about preparation and care and thinking about when to push and when not to push. A friend of mine, David Rode, at the New York Times, he got kidnapped in Afghanistan, because he was pursuing a scoop. You know, what's the word scoop in Portuguese? Furo. He was really excited, young journalist. He was connecting with the Taliban, and he went to do an interview, and it was a setup, and he got kidnapped, and he spent many months in. That's terrible. And in Russia now, of course, we had a Wall Street Journal reporter who spent a year in prison. So there are challenges, but being part of a community, being careful when you need to be careful, but finding ways to push forward is really important too.
Olá, bom dia. Meu nome é Aline. E eu vou assistir um documentário falando que nessa causa climática, muitos biólogos, cientistas falam bastante sobre isso, mas não tem a resposta necessária da população. A população não faz nada. Tanto que isso aumenta até os casos de depressão, porque sabe que o mundo está quase no fim, mas ninguém faz nada. Então, no caso do jornalismo, eu gostaria de saber como o senhor lida, e também o jornal em si, porque são matérias que nem... Tem, às vezes, que fazer viagens, que tem que ter esse investimento monetário, mas, às vezes, não tem a resposta do público. Às vezes, do engajamento, porque não tem interesse, não lê até o final, ou não engaja nessa causa. Então, eu gostaria de saber quais foram as mudanças em relação a isso desde o início e como que é visto atualmente.
Yeah. This is a key issue and opportunity. It's both. The problem is, as I explained earlier, we like to grab people's attention. So many times climate stories are presented in a way that's more dramatic and more depressing than the reality. This is a slow issue. There's still possibilities for solving it, but no one wants to read that story. So another friend of mine, David Wallace Wells, wrote a book called The Uninhabitable Earth, where he took every possible bad projection of climate and put it into a book. And it was a #1 bestseller, great success, based on a story that said the same thing. And now recently he wrote a big story for the New York Times Magazine saying, oh, you know, it's not so bad. But he did something very irresponsible to me. And he got a bestseller, he's rich, he got a lot of attention, he fueled a lot of dismay. Young people are very worried about global warming because they see these caricatured descriptions of the problem, and that's paralytic. That's like the complexity. It's like the doom monster instead of the complexity monster. And so I think we just have a responsibility to find ways that convey the reality. Like I said, with the risk formula, you see, yeah, this is a big complex problem, but there are dimensions that everyone can work on, whether you're a teacher or a journalist or an artist or a scientist or an investor. These are the things that together we can do to get away from like a doom framing, which is preponderant. And I do, you know, sometimes politicians and the UN, like I said, Secretary General Guterres is a good guy, I'm sure, but he likes to kind of present that doom scenario in ways that I think are unjustified, and I wish he would find a way to not feed people's fears and to activate them more. So that kind of thing.
Bom dia, eu sou o Samuel Amaral. Andrew, o senhor falou sobre a importância de buscar bons dados, em bons bancos de dados, informações científicas, enfim. Mas nós, como jornalistas, como a gente pode fazer um bom tratamento dessas informações? Evitar uma leitura errada ou associar informações de uma forma ilógica e, ao invés disso, fazer uma boa base para a nossa matéria, fazer uma matéria bem científica, baseada e bem estruturada.
That's great. There's some great examples of this recently. Taking different sources of data and putting them together to create, to identify problems and also solutions. The New York Times, there are two journalists, Brad Plumer, Plumer, and Nadia Popovich, Popovich. She's a data journalist. She does all the crunching, and he's the writer and reporter. And for example, they did a piece 4 years ago looking at racial patterns in cities and looking at heat in cities. Where are the hottest places that are most dangerous for heat? And places that have the most black populations are also the most vulnerable to heat. And that was it was based on some science. So there were some papers that were published in scientific journals. And they collaborated with the scientists to get the data and present it to New York Times readers in a way that you see, wow. And the bottom line was that the racist history of development patterns in cities led to that reality. So the decisions in the 1930s that were pushing black families to live in certain areas had resulted in more exposure to heat. And I think that's a great example of how to use data, how to present it to people in a way that then leads us to think about cities going forward in a more productive, equal way. Lots of opportunities.
Bom dia, meu nome é Clara. Eu gostaria de saber qual é a opinião do senhor sobre um discurso muito comum que é propagado na mídia, que prega que as pequenas ações cotidianas do público podem influenciar positivamente nesse cenário de aquecimento global. Então, aquela ideia do banho mais curto, da economia cotidiana de água. Qual é a sua opinião? E eu gostaria de saber também, quando o senhor menciona esse engajamento do público e essa tomada de atitude, a que o senhor se refere? Que tipo de atitude o público pode ser movido a tomar?
Those are very relevant. They're very related questions. And engagement comes from understanding that what may seem to be an incremental action can be significant if many people do it. There are, in the United States right now, because of Biden administration passed 2 big bills that are like $1 trillion to spend on infrastructure, on better roads and power plants, and also on personal household innovation to use less energy. Heat pumps, which are like a new kind of air conditioner. That's a heat pump, actually. A heat pump works for cold and heat. And there, one person putting in a heat pump instead of burning gas in their furnace is not a solution. But if you start to see at the community scale that can make a big difference. So journalism can provide information on how that money gets spent. I've written a piece on my Substack thing about this. One of the newest, the new climate communication story is making sure people have access to resources. It's not just the bad guy, good guy story anymore. And these resources all exist, but if they're only exploited by people who are wealthy, for example, then that doesn't really address the problem. So finding ways to do community scale, local outreach that gives people an understanding of these things they can do in their house. Or electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are complicated. I don't have an EV. I have a hybrid, and so I'm not going to go there. It's hard. But with household energy, there's lots of things that can do, but only if they're at wide scale, and there's ways to do that. So I could follow up with you and send you a link to that article if you want. Revkin@gmail.
Acho que o professor também poderia fazer uma última pergunta.
É bem rápido, né? Última pergunta aqui. Andrew, gostaria que você falasse um pouco sobre a relação da questão da temática climática e também com a geopolítica internacional. Porque, por exemplo, né, você acabou de comentar agora dos carros elétricos. Né? Os carros elétricos, a bateria são de lítio e as reservas de lítio estão nos países do sul global. Então existe também uma relação geopolítica importante em relação, né, a esses recursos, por exemplo, e também a disputa pelo controle dessas reservas minerais necessárias para esses recursos ambientais. Né? Como é que fica essa questão da geopolítica internacional, as disputas geopolíticas, e também com a questão ambiental? E como o jornalismo reflete isso? Né?
Yeah. Well, one way I think about that is, along with the complexity monster and the doom monster, meaning there's what I call the scale monster. To do anything that actually will slow climate change for energy, with energy choices, requires massive scale. And Greenpeace, a lot of green groups have been slow to acknowledge that doing electric vehicles, replacing fossil fuel vehicles with electric vehicles requires a huge amount of lithium and cobalt, and the cobalt comes from mines, children mining in sub-Saharan Africa, and we have lithium galore in South America. That those are important environmental issues too. But it's really, if you want to have a massive change in energy, energy is such a fundamental part of the human experience and needs that, and many people in the world still don't have adequate energy in places I've been in India and sub-Saharan Africa and here in South America. So we need much, much, much more energy. And we have to acknowledge that will come with impacts, and the same questions that we focus on the fossil fuel companies or food companies about have to be focused on when we think about clean energy transitions as well. It's the same, who, what, where, when, why, you know, where is it going to come from? Who is it going to hurt? That whole risk, climate risk formula, hazard, exposure, vulnerability, also relates to supply chains for energy. And it's the same questions whether it's lithium or oil or gas or coal. So that gives you, again, a landscape of stories at every level, global to local.
A gente ainda tem 5 minutinhos, eu acho que se o professor quiser fazer mais uma pergunta, não teria problema. Então, eu ia fazer uma pergunta muito assim, atual, na verdade, relacionado à mudança de postura do governo atual em relação ao petróleo no Brasil. Nessa sinalização que a gente tem de redução das emissões. Nessa mudança que o atual governo tem de posição em relação à exploração de petróleo e essa tendência que a gente tem de tentar reduzir as emissões de gases, como você acha que a gente resolve isso no Brasil? Assim, como tem que ser uma cobertura crítica em relação a isso?
Do you mean that still expanding production, but with fewer emissions from the production?
A gente tem a região do sul, a região da Foz do Amazonas, que foi encontrado petróleo recentemente. Na verdade, recentemente não, desde a década de 60. Houve uma tentativa de exploração, deu errado, e agora o governo está tentando explorar novamente. Isso vai totalmente na contramão, né? Então, eu queria... Isso é uma coisa que, inclusive, na América Latina está sendo bastante discutido, né? Então, não sei se o senhor gostaria de conversar sobre isso e opinar assim, a respeito disso.
See if I can say this briefly. There are many countries at many stages of development that still have a lot of access to oil and gas. And there are good arguments, including by some planetary scientists like Johan Rockstrom, Rokstrom. He's very concerned about planetary boundaries, and he's a total sustainability-focused analyst. But he said countries that historically have low levels of energy and development are justified in using more oil and gas, producing more of it, because we owe them that space. That they're still developing their countries, they still develop their economies, and it's up to the rich countries that already built their economies on fossil fuels to do the real heavy decarbonization push. And so there's a moral argument at the global scale for there to be what's called carbon space. India made this argument at the COPs, the COP 25, 26, 27, 28. And I think they're justified in having that argument. Now, that still means if you're going to develop oil and gas, it has to benefit not just the company. You have to make sure that's not robbing society of the value of that. And you have to make sure it's done with environmental care. So I think that's the approach. In the United States, similarly, the Gulf of Mexico, we have tons of oil and gas. And some people say we shouldn't burn any of it anymore. And there's an argument, well, we should do it here. We should extract our oil and gas and do it very responsibly with low impacts, because otherwise, if we seek it from countries that are not responsible for the environment, that's worse for the world. So it's kind of complicated to a certain extent, but it's still simple ultimately. We need a lot of energy. We're not just suddenly transitioning off of oil and gas, particularly, and finding out how to make that beneficial to societies, even as the work of decarbonizing the global energy economy happens, is a key story.
Acho que é isso, pessoal. Muito obrigada.
Pessoal, antes de acabar, são 5 brindes, tá? Que a gente ganhou. Nada mais justo a gente dar para 5 pessoas que fizeram perguntas.
That's great. And I would love it if to hear from you. Ask me more questions on, via email or on Twitter. So thanks for staying in touch. And maybe I can visit your classroom sometime online too.